one of the things they did was a preaching class. And so there was a formal part to that, but there was also a practical part. We went out into these little churches that were out in these beautiful villages in the Cotswolds. And this was summer term, Trinity term, so it was beautiful weather. We go out for the evening prayer time. So it was a new every week, and it was my turn. And I prepared this talk. And of course, I was living with young graduate students, and I was in a university town, and I was working with Fellowship of Christian Athletes some, and I was just enmeshed in this young kind of 20s experience. So I had this sermon that would have worked great if you were 22. And when we got to the church, it was an absolutely gorgeous church on this village green, there were 4 wonderful octogenarian women. And unlike this group, they sat at the back, the very back of the church. So I'm in this raised pulpit, doing my best to preach this sermon, and came to the end. And I had these other students who were also learning to preach, and our professor. And he said, now before we go, we're going to gather together as a group with the congregation. So we sat down, and he asked these, just put them on the spot. And of course, they were very nice Anglican ladies. They said, oh, it's marvelous, marvelous, absolutely marvelous. And then he asked them the dangerous question. Now, what did you learn from the sermon today? Can you share a point or two? Dead silence. It was pretty clear the sermon had missed the mark. I had not known what kind of group I was preaching to, and none of the illustrations were fit. I mean, it just didn't work. So I'm about to ask you the dangerous question. So we've done 8 previous weeks, 8 months, right? 8 individual times. What have you learned about lament? What have you heard that you're going to carry away? And we better not have dead silence, or I'm in serious trouble, right? So what have you learned?
Not a negative word, like I used to kind of think it was.
And in what sense would it be a positive? What's positive about lament?
You have hope. It's healing.
Good. There's healing and there's hope. I'm going to write down your answers as we go along here. Good.
There's a difference between lament and grieving.
And how would you describe that difference? How would you put that?
Well, in grieving is more interior of the person that died.
Mm-hmm.
It's more intimate. Where lamenting is you can, say, God,
You can turn it into prayer.
Yeah.
It's like you're turning your grief into prayer.
Exactly.
I love that.
And I thought that was an interesting concept, that there is the difference between them.
Yeah, that's good. Very good.
Grieving is what you've lost, but lament can show hope for what could come.
Yeah, lament is an appeal as well, isn't it? It's an appeal to that things will change, and it's a hope that they will. Yeah, good. Yeah, so.
It's a catharsis, and you can renew.
Oh, very good.
You can renew yourself by going through this.
Yeah, this is all good. My response would be to say that, the world has tragedy, right?
Yeah.
And not to respond to it is, in the biblical sense, unfeeling, unloving, and inauthentic. So the Bible, God has created us in such a way that we are made to respond to loss and tragedy. And when you think about, remember we learned about the alternatives. What if you don't respond with lament? Well, then you have 2 options. You can suppress the actual sorrow that you're feeling, and we know what that does. Sorrow turned inward becomes depression or anger, and it's not a good mental health thing. Or you can become a person that's hard-hearted, that doesn't feel sorrow over tragedy. And so in either of those ways, you become a biblically inauthentic person. You're not the disciple Jesus wants. So lament, another way of thinking about this is lament is part of the logic of love. It is the nature of love to experience loss in a world where there's tragedy. We also learned that who else laments? God laments. And so when we lament in a holy sense, we are actually joining in something that God is already doing. God's heart breaks over the things that are broken in the world. And so when we're lamenting over those things, we are joining with God. We are actually becoming closer to God and more like God when we allow our hearts to lament over the things that are broken in the world. Does that make sense? And it's interesting. I think we learn this emotional freedom and this spiritual freedom to lament. Oftentimes we learn that from our parents. It's our parents' ability or our grandparents' ability maybe to be free enough to have those emotions and express them. That this is kind of how we learn that. Have you ever had someone try to come alongside you when you were having a difficulty that was not empathetic? They knew they had to come alongside you. It was their duty, but you didn't feel that emotionally they were connecting with where you were.
I've heard them say, get over it.
There you go. Yeah, I'm glad you'll soon be over this. Yeah. There's lots of ways that can be expressed, but if God wants us to come alongside people, he wants us to be able to empathize with them. And lament is what prepares our hearts for those moments when we have to come alongside people. So there's a kind of a spiritual capacity that grows in us through lament. It's a mentally and spiritually healthy thing. This was a point Bonnie was making about catharsis. There's something about lament that releases us, that frees us. And then you guys got it right away, that lament is always something that's expressed within a framework of hope. And that means that you can appeal because you're trusting in God's power, and you can expect because you believe the world is going to change. And we're going to live into that last theme in this last, that last point is really the theme of what we're going to be looking at today. Before I read the scriptures, I want to contrast a little bit, and I want you to turn the paper over and look at C, which is other visions of the end. So what we're talking about with Christian ideas of hope is how are things ultimately going to be? What's final? And there are a variety of different pictures of that we have in the world. Some people would say in the ancient world that what happens in this life beyond life is there's an underworld. How many of you would like to live in your basement? Well, how many of you have a basement, I should say, in Arizona, right? Not here. Right. Yeah, he had one in Illinois, right? Actually, we are the church that has the most basements in Arizona. No one has as many basements as we do. But, you don't want to live in your basement. And in the underworld was a kind of a basement experience. It was dark, it was shadowy, it didn't have any color to it. It was not something to look forward to. The underworld. You had to guard it so people wouldn't escape because they wanted to get out of there. No one wanted to get in. It's not like the pearly gates where people are hoping for admission. So that was one perspective. Another perspective that you see is that, we're just kind of, we go into oblivion. We cease to exist. Or there's some other more mystical versions of that where we're kind of absorbed into the cosmic soup. Ancients were fascinated with the idea that, they didn't have chemistry. They didn't understand how states would change and forms would change, but they were fascinated by fire because you could take a solid object like a piece of wood. Where did it go? It turned to dust and it floated up into the atmosphere. And so some people envisioned that was what happened at the end of life. You were just kind of absorbed into the elements. This was a picture of what happened. Some people think that freed from the body, some of our spirit, our consciousness, is kind of absorbed into a more universal consciousness. That's another picture of what's going to happen in the end. So with those rather vague, unpleasant, and unsatisfying images in mind, I want you to listen to how concrete and how hearty and how real and how connected to our lives the Bible's pictures of the life beyond life are. We have one from Isaiah, so we're talking about the 7th century kind of the end of the 700s and the beginning of the 600s. And we are talking also about Revelation, the final book in the Bible. And we're going to, by the way, be doing our next series is going to be on Revelation. It's going to last for 2 months in the summer. So that's just a little advertisement. We're going to do Isaiah first. Here we go. Listen for the word of the Lord. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines that are strained perfectly clear. And he will destroy in this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over the nations. This is a morgue image, right? What do they do with the dead body? And on the scene of the crime, they put the sheet over the top. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord will wipe away the tears from every face, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from the earth. For the Lord has spoken, and it will be said on that day, Lo, this is our God. We've waited for him so that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we've waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. For the hand of the Lord will rest on this mountain. So that's 700 years before Jesus. And then 100 years after Jesus, you have Revelation. And it goes like this. It's poetry. I love this passage. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea it was no more. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down, descending from heaven, adorned like a bride for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne that was saying, See, the home of God is among mortals. He'll dwell with them. They'll be his people, and God himself will be with them. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And death, why death it will be no more. And mourning and crying and pain, they will be no more. For the first things will have passed away. And the one who was seated on the throne spoke again and said, See, I am making all things new. First person. Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true, O John. It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life, and those who conquer will inherit these things. I will again be their God, and they will be my children. This is the word of the Lord. All right. Well, you notice some similarities between these two, don't you? There's some connections there, verbal and images, and we're going to explore that a little bit. But I want you to kind of think in your minds, between Isaiah and Revelation is Jesus. And this hope that we're talking about gets very strong by Revelation because of what is seen in the middle in Jesus. And so we want to look at some of these images. You know, we heard the Shadowland imagery, the Hades and the underworld, this vague kind of thing that happens, you're absorbed into the cosmic soup. This is so concrete. God will make a feast for you. It's a party. And we know in the first century that, you know, eating was kind of a semi-sacred thing. It was kind of like our communion. When you ate with people, you were accepting each other into your circle of friendship and love and connection. And so there's going to be this wonderful feast. It's such a great image. And there's going to be awesome entrees, you know? Rich, it's going to be Chateaubriand. And, you know, the best type of meat. We have a member who is a French chef. She's a beautiful gal. And every once in a while, she decides to bring by our house some of those cuts of meat. She just delivers them. They come in a little package with ice, and we are extremely grateful. We have a wonderful, even I can cook that and make it come out pretty well. So yeah, this is this picture, and a wonderful picture of these wines, you know, that's so concrete. Well, it's interesting. Let's now turn to Revelation. Do we have something like this in Revelation? Well, we do. It's implied in the wedding image. And think back to you, if you got married, think back to your wedding celebration, right? What was that like? How long did it last? Did you stay for the whole party, or did you make a dramatic departure, like 3/4 of the way through? How many did dramatic departure? Did you? How many stayed for the whole party? Yeah. So it's fun, you know, all these customs. And my parents were married on my mom's farm, and we were married at a friend's house where we put up a big tent, and sometimes they kick you out if you're at a hotel. You only have the limited amount of time to stay. But there's a wedding party image that's implied in this, right? Because the people descend like a bride adorned for a husband. They're coming for a consummation of a relationship, a celebration of love, and a party that will follow. Now, your party's probably lasted 4 or 5 hours, right? Was it 4 or 5 hours? 6 hours, maybe? And you remember the Jewish parties lasted all week. People went home and came back for the next meal, and then the next day, and then the 2 meals that day, and on and on and on. It was lunch and dinner for the whole week. So that's Revelation 21. Well, how does that connect with Jesus? Well, Jesus' ministry, you can think of it almost like a moving celebration. And we see this right away, of course, in John chapter 2, his first public miracle. He turns the water into... So what could go on? The wedding party. See, there it is. He is the one who, when the wine runs out, supplies the wine, keeps the party going. And he picks up that image a lot of times in his teaching. So the story of the prodigal son culminates in a party to which people are invited and drawn in. The whole village comes. The drama of it is, will the elder son join, or will he just stand off in his stiffness? But Jesus' ministry is a kind of invitation to parties. And we see all these moments when he would meet someone, and sometimes he was that guy who invited himself to your house for a party. You remember how he did with Zacchaeus? Come out of that tree, I'm coming to your house for a party today. And let's include some of these other people. This was a characteristic of his ministry. Also, when he taught about final things, he pictured them as a feast or a party. Remember? So it's interesting how these three movements relate when it comes to parties. Well, who comes to the party? This is very interesting. In Isaiah, and remember, this is a Jewish nation that is, pretty ethnocentric. But Isaiah is a prophet that has this bigger vision. He says, the Lord of hosts will make this feast, in verse 6, for all peoples. It's become a universal feast. And you will remember that then in Revelation, there is also the New Jerusalem is a city. It's interesting that the image of life beyond life is not just a garden restored where we're kind of off somewhere, on our own. It's a city. It's a vibrant community of people. And in Revelation 22, which is kind of connected to 21, we also have this reiteration that it's going to be many nations and many different peoples that are going to come. Well, that hope is stronger because of the way Jesus did his ministry. What were his last words in Matthew? Go out into all the world and make disciples of all ethnes, all people, right? And he broke those barriers when he was relating to people. He started to reach out to people beyond the boundaries of Jewish nationalism. So you can see again how this old hope becomes a stronger future hope because it becomes concrete in Jesus. You actually see God reaching out beyond the boundaries to these people. I'm fascinated that it's a communal experience, but it's also a very individual experience. We hear that God will, the image that we have, he will wipe away the tears from everyone's face. This is this idea that we're not going to lose our individuality at the final conclusion of life. We're not absorbed into some cosmic soup. But Jan is going to be Jan and Bev is going to be Bev. And we're going to be able to recognize each other because we're going to have faces. One of the hardest things about the pandemic has been not able to see people's faces. It's difficult, right? And, it was necessary. And it's interesting that the session is now voting on a proposal from our risk management committee. They have 3 days to respond. They're not really voting because they've given the committee kind of the authority to do it, but they have 3 days to object, in which case we would all get together and have a meeting. But we're proposing that on Pentecost, which, by the way, is the 23rd of this month, that we will set aside our balcony for social distancing and masking and an area we're working on somewhere over here, but that for the rest, masks will be optional. And so you can wear them if you want to, but you'll be just making your own mitigation decisions, essentially. Be able, since people can now get vaccines, and you can estimate your own risk. So we'll accommodate folks who want to wear masks and don't want to wear masks. And I'm looking forward to it, seeing those faces, right? Yeah. So there's this individual character that is there. The comfort that's given also in Revelation 21 is individual. And of course, we know that Jesus just took a lot of time with individuals. He wasn't like the pastor that came out, preached to the stadium, and disappeared, didn't get to know anybody. He stopped a lot to get to know people and to give them names and nicknames and to connect individually with them. Speaking of comfort and healing, there is a freedom from certain things that happens in the life beyond life. And so in Isaiah, we have, we have the shroud being taken away. The shroud is a kind of a symbol of the fear of death. Why do we cover up the body? Because we have a certain fear and horror with death, with its finality, with its mystery, with its suddenness, and with our lack of control over it. And so there's a fear. Imagine life without fear. When I think about fear, I think about this guy I grew up with in my second neighborhood. We moved from a kind of city situation to a suburban situation, and it was sort of a new gang of kids that I was getting to know. And I got to know them over a summer, and then school started. And there was one kid who I had never seen all summer. Not because he was away, but because other than traveling on the bus, he was not allowed out of his yard by his parents. And this continued through the last 2 years of elementary school, middle school, and high school. They kept him in the yard. And that was because they were afraid that something would happen to him beyond the yard. And I think one parent was mainly afraid of like a dangerous thing happening, and the other parent was more afraid of like him being socialized in a way they wouldn't want by the neighborhood kids, like we were the problem. And he was so afraid that he couldn't sit with anyone. He couldn't talk to any of the kids. He would do this. Mm-hmm. Right? Fear, think of the way fear can cripple and inhibit us. And the claim, the dream in Isaiah 25 is that without the fear of death, and without the fear of war, and without the fear of evil, life will be free. There will be a new level of joy that becomes possible. And you see that echoed in Revelation 21. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, and death will be no more. And once those tears are dried, they're never going to happen again. There's going to be no reason to lament. Again, how does this connect with Jesus? Well, Jesus spent a lot of time comforting people and a lot of time relieving them from the fear they had of whatever they were dealing with, whether it was a disease or they had lost someone. He restored people to life. He spent a lot of time at this whole ministry of freeing people from things. And then the joyous part of it is freed from things like fear. We are freed for something. And that is intimacy. And so all of these passages have this wonderful kind of intimacy. There's the intimacy in Isaiah 25 of this wonderful feast. There's the use of the word we. Salvation is individual, but it's also collective. We are going to have this experience together. It becomes very explicit in Revelation 21, where we hear that God will be their God. He will be with them. This is repeated again and again. And they will be his children. Do you want a drink of water? Do we have some water? I have some tea. Little tea. There you go. A little bit of tea. It's still a little warm. There you go.
Just gonna drink it all.
That's all right. I can easily make more tea.
I'm sure you can.
And I'll leave that with you in case you need that again. There you go. So we were talking about what are we free for, and this basically we're free for family. You know, there's this intimate family sense. Most of our feasts take place with our intimates. And this idea is God will become an intimate with us. He'll be with us. There'll be a companionship and a connection. And Jesus, of course, did this a lot. He was very explicit about this. You know, his last promises were, I will be with you always. And you'll become parts of my family. I no longer call you disciples or servants, but I call you friends and family. He does this on the cross. Remember with John, he forms a new family between his mother and his disciples. It's like now we have access to the heavenly family. We get connected in. Jesus' language in John also has this, it's this mystical language. As I am in the Father and the Father is in me, so you will be in me and you will be in the Father. There will be this, it's like we enter into this connection to the Trinity. It's beautiful, intimacy. And then finally, there is an absolute finality about this. So there's moments where we are, we're saved from things, and then, we have that problem reoccur again later. But the beautiful thing about these pictures is that these are kind of forever pictures. And I see that here with a couple of things that are in the passage. One is this business of the water of life. In Isaiah, that death is swallowed up forever, and then the water of life is given as a gift in Revelation 21. The water of life image is this, goes back to the garden, but it's also one perfectly clear in the passage in John 4 that we all love so much, where Jesus meets the woman from Samaria. That you notice what he says to her. He says, if you knew who was talking to you, you would ask that person, i.e. me, and I would give you a gift of water that would be within you a spring that would never run out. You would have a kind of life in you that would gush up, and it would just go on for eternity. It would never end. Extraordinary thing to say to someone in a conversation. And we symbolize that directly with our baptismal font. Because, we had the font here, and we would fill it when we needed to. It was over here. We'd bring some water from the tap, behind the scenes thing, dump it in there. I sometimes would heat it up, because you don't want to put cold water on a baby's head, right? They don't react well to that. You'd warm it up a little bit. But there it is. And, use when necessary. Out here, it has become a fountain that runs all the time.
And the birds love it.
The birds love it. Yeah, there's a little bird corner there, right? It's a little bit of St. Francis, right, within the Protestant tradition. But it's also from the place from which we take the water for baptism in here. So I have a baptism this week, and then the following week we have two of our young people who are being baptized for the first time that are joining the church on Youth Sunday, which is on the 16th. And the water will come from that fountain because of this promise of Jesus, the woman of Samaria. There's a water that's running all the time, and it will never run out. So that is just a beautiful, powerful thing. So you see, again, in all these instances, what you've got is a historic hope that becomes a personal, concrete thing in the life of Jesus, and that leads to this revelation hope, that all creation is going to experience what people actually saw and felt and tasted with Jesus. The same kind of intimacy, the same kind of freedom from problems and illness and pain, the same kind of sense of family, the same sense of celebration would eventually be present for everyone. And there's no better way, I think, than to finish. And this is in the book. This is a beautiful insight from our book. But I thought we would actually get a chance to listen together today to one of the great gospel songs that is kind of the unofficial national anthem of African Americans. Yeah. And I think we're going to get it. Here we go. This is Kirk Franklin.
encouraging. And we're taking the church ready. Let's go! We'll be marching right until the victory is won. To all my brothers out there. Hold your head up, brother, till the victory is won. To all my sisters in the struggle. Keep believing, sister, till the victory is won. Till that day. Till that day comes. Let us march on. To victory. Till victory is won.
I spent 2 years in Princeton in an African American church. I was the only white person for one of those years. The choir wasn't quite this good, though, I have to say. They were good, but not this good. That's a pretty good choir right there.
At the inaugural of President Obama, and I was inside the Smithsonian building. In fact, I was in the washroom, and all of a sudden, the walls started sort of vibrating, and I hurried up and went out, this big rotunda, and there were gobs and gobs of people down, and that is what everybody was singing. The whole building was vibrating.
Yeah.
It was the most heartrending thing I've ever experienced in Washington, D.C. at Obama's inaugural.
Yeah.
I meant the building.
Smithsonian building.
Yeah. So let's just conclude our season of lament with a prayer to our great God. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the hope and that sustains us even in difficulty and in trial and temptation and in struggle for justice, for wholeness, for health, for peace, and for all the things that characterize your kingdom. We thank you that you put us in the middle of that struggle, and that when we're faced with tragedy, whether it's personal or collective, you've given us hearts that are big enough to feel the pain of others. And there's room enough in those hearts for this unassailable hope. And we thank you that that's rooted not just in the prophecies of the Old Testament seers like Isaiah, but it is rooted in the disciples of Jesus who saw miracles, felt comfort, knew love, enjoyed intimacy with the one who shared your heart with the world. And so, like the author John of Revelation, let us look forward to the restoration of all things and face every moment with that hope that shapes even our sorrow, in your Son's great name. And all God's women said, Amen. Amen. Thank you for this year.